Do you tend to stuff your feelings down, pushing them away? Feelings like fear and sadness and anger. This is called emotional suppression, and this is actually a pretty common coping mechanism for emotions. But this strategy has a lot of hidden costs. Suppressing your emotions has actually been shown to increase your physiological stress response. It's also been shown to impact your memory, and it can impact your relationships negatively. So, in the next 10 minutes, let's talk about what emotional suppression is, why it backfires, and what you can do about it. So, emotional suppression is when you inhibit your emotions, and this could be done very consciously. It can be done subconsciously, and sometimes when it's done unconsciously, it can be called repression. And the inhibition can be on what you are showing to the world, right? We sometimes can suppress the expression of our emotions so we don't let others know what's happening. But often we actually try to suppress the emotion itself, denying it, avoiding it, running away from it. So emotional suppression exists on a spectrum, right? So at one end, we all need to suppress the expression of our emotions sometimes, on occasion, in particular situations that can be adaptive. Not starting to cry when you are in the middle of an intense negotiation at work, right? Not erupting in anger at your boss or out in public or at your spouse, not erupting with everything that we're feeling. So we can choose when to share our emotions, right? And temporarily kind of at least suppress the expression of them. But as long as we acknowledge the emotion and then work through it at some point without too big of a lag, that's what I would call adaptive, right? It's a coping strategy that probably works for us. So let's put that all the way over here on the spectrum. Then here we have certain emotions, and people tend to have certain emotions that they really like to suppress. So some people really want to suppress any feelings of anger. Others don't allow themselves to feel sadness. And so here people are aware they're having that feeling, know they don't want it, and they do what they can to squish it down. Moving a little bit into the middle, this could be where somebody does what I just mentioned, but they do it for like all their emotions or all the negative emotions. And then if we keep this up, or maybe we learn this very, very young, we get to the point where we are completely suppressing emotions without really being aware of it. And I'll talk about some signs that that happens. And then all the way over here would be more of what's called repression, where the emotion is suppressed completely unconsciously, out of your conscious awareness. So some very common techniques used to suppress emotions in this kind of realm, in this realm of we are conscious of it and we don't want to feel it, would be staying too busy. Nope, too busy, can't deal with it, got to keep going, running on adrenaline. I'm okay feeling all the anxiety I have and stress about all this stuff, but I'm not going to feel those deeper emotions, the hurt or the sadness or even the anger. Another common coping strategy would be avoidance. I know seeing those people makes me stressed, or going and doing XYZ thing makes me anxious. I'm going to avoid it. Another super common technique that I never hear talked about really is overriding it with our habitual emotion. So there are some people who feel anxious all the time, and that anxiety probably covers up some deeper and more difficult emotions, usually hurt, sadness. Other people might be angry all the time, and that anger does the same thing. It covers up those more vulnerable emotions that people don't like to feel. So I call those our habitual emotions. So if this is something that you can relate to, it's worth investigating. And we can talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the video today. Fake positivity is another common method of dealing with difficult emotions that is suppression. And that could be both fake positivity to the outside world as well as to ourselves, basically denying that we're having any of those difficult emotions. So denial is also one of them, as I just mentioned. Now, signs that you might be suppressing your emotions without even being aware of it, whether it's subconscious or unconscious, could be chronic health issues, unexplained anxiety or depression, feeling detached, feeling numb, feeling unconnected from even yourself or your own life, right? That's a signal of fairly advanced emotional suppression. And there's no judgment here. This happens for many reasons, and these are very common. And I recently put out a video on why am I so emotionally dysregulated, which I'm guessing most of the people who are attracted to that title will be those who have these huge overblown emotions. But it also applies to people who suppress. Emotional dysregulation is both. It's both of those extremes. So it might be worth your checking out that video. So I want to highlight 3 areas which have been scientifically proven to be impacted if you regularly suppress your emotions. One of those is about how you feel, both physically, your physiology, and your kind of emotional feelings. The second is the cognitive consequences, the consequences on how you think. And the third is the consequences on relationship. So starting with the physiological and affective impacts, right? Affective being the affect, the emotion. There's a lot of research that shows that when we suppress emotions, we actually make them stronger. Now, they might eke out in other ways, or they might be contained until they explode. But suppressing them in general makes them worse. It's also been shown that it takes a lot of our energy and mental focus to suppress emotions. So there's a really high tax in terms of the effort we have to put in to do that. There are cardiovascular connections to suppressing emotions, including blood pressure being higher, blood vessels constricting. Obviously, those are related. And there's been some research that has shown a connection to certain chronic illnesses. And while that research is not definitive, it makes sense. So there's one research article, which I will link where this comes from, but where they had people watching movies and they told one, feel whatever you feel. And they told the other person, try not to be impacted by what you're watching. And while they were doing this, they monitored their heart rate and their blood pressure. And that's where they saw in actual evidence that the people who were suppressing the emotion, really trying not to feel anything, that their blood pressure increased, their heart rate increased, so their stress chemicals are increasing. And we do know that continually elevated stress chemicals are tied to a number of chronic illnesses. So I don't want to bum you out, make you worry about this, because there are solutions to this, and I'm going to get to that. But I just want to highlight that it has a real cost on you physically and emotionally. And then the cognitive impact, people's memories are worse if they're suppressing their emotions. And it kind of makes sense if we think about that energy issue that I mentioned earlier. If you're putting your focus on suppressing the emotion, controlling it, not showing it, you've got a lot that you're thinking about and you're not really paying attention to what's happening around you. And we only encode in memory what we pay attention to. And now, before you argue with me, I don't mean that all of our attention has to be conscious, right? Because again, consciousness exists on a spectrum. But what we are aware of, we encode. So if our focus is on suppressing our emotions, our memory is not going to be as good. Okay. Third area, impact on relationships. So generally when you suppress your emotions, it ends up suppressing both negative and positive. So that isn't great for relationships. But what I also find is that when you have somebody who suppresses their emotions and has that false positivity, it can be really distancing for the other partner. Your partner will get this feeling, or it could be a friend, it could be a romantic relationship, it could be a sibling or parent-child. But if somebody's suppressing their emotions, you get this feeling like you just don't know what's going on with them. Like they maybe feel like a stranger. It makes emotional intimacy very difficult. And then I recently read some really interesting research that showed that when somebody is next to someone who is actively suppressing their emotions, the person next to them has an increase in their stress chemicals. And the research that was done on this paired two people who didn't know each other, told one to suppress their emotions, and looked at all of the physiological signs in the other person. And to be honest, I experienced that. I can think of a lot of examples where I'm kind of worried about something or processing something, and I'm with somebody who's like, everything's fine. Ooh, it makes my stress levels go up. So I could definitely relate to that research. So this has a real world impact, right? Missing details in conversations, missing opportunities for emotional connection. And probably what's missing most deeply is an emotional connection with yourself. Because over time, you stop knowing what you're feeling. Eventually, you might feel numbed out about everything, or your emotions just feel like this sort of messy area. You just try to keep them in a box and you don't even know what they are. So, the solution, right? We have to have the solution. So, there is a solution, and this will take time, but it's worth the effort. So, the very first thing is to begin to think about your emotions differently. All emotions are giving you information. Our emotions are really a treasure trove of information that is really helpful for navigating the world, for knowing what we want, for knowing who we are, where we want to go, what we want to aim for, who we want to be with. All of that is provided via our emotions. And definitely some emotions are really pleasant to feel and others are really unpleasant to feel. But if we stop thinking of them as bad or good, and we look at all of them as, okay, this emotion is giving me information. What information is it giving me? Changing that viewpoint will be enormously helpful. The other viewpoint to change about emotions is to separate the emotion from the behavior that comes from that emotion. In working with people over 20 years as a therapist, so many people would be like, well, anger is bad. Anger's bad. No, the feeling of anger is not bad. The behavior that anger can lead to, acting out in anger, can lead to some pretty negative consequences. That behavior, maybe you want to judge it good behavior, bad behavior, but the feeling itself is not bad. So if you think about unpleasant versus pleasant, fine, that's real. That's valid, right? Some emotions we really like feeling, some we don't. But don't tie the emotion to behavior that either comes out of it for you or other people. So a lot of people that I worked with who suppressed their emotions had a parent who would act out in anger all the time. And that child had to learn to suppress their emotions. They had to learn to suppress their emotions in order to survive. But as they grew up, it also rationally made sense to them. I don't want to be horrible like my parent. I don't want to explode in anger, be abusive, do all of that stuff. And that's what anger does. No, anger doesn't do that. So really cutting the feeling here, behavior here. And what behavior comes out of your feeling is part of emotional intelligence and part of emotional regulation. When we learn to appropriately regulate our emotion, we're not denying them, we're not suppressing them, we're acknowledging them, we're investigating them. We might even be problem solving what comes out of them. But with emotional regulation, you can then choose what behavior comes out of that emotion. So I really think this is like the big step one is changing your opinion of what emotions are. And then the big step two is acceptance. Acceptance of the emotion that you're having, validation of the emotion that you're having. Many of us growing up, our emotions were not validated, really common. And it can lead to a number of emotional regulation problems. So learning to validate your emotion for yourself and accept it. Yup, I feel angry. I'm going to validate that something happened and my response was anger. And it's probably a pretty reasonable response. Just the feeling, right? Again, we're not talking about what behavior comes out of it. But when you accept and acknowledge your emotions, some people talk about like inviting them in for tea. You can then explore, okay, what information is this emotion telling me? Is the anger telling me that somebody crossed my boundaries? Is the anger telling me that somebody hurt me? That's a biggie. My feelings get hurt. Don't want to feel that. I get angry. So anger is often a cover-up emotion, but it's by accepting it, validating it, and then beginning to investigate it that you figure out what triggered it, why, and what's the deeper, more vulnerable emotion that's under it. So in one of my major online programs, it's called The Roadmap to Joy and Authentic Confidence. We have an entire section on understanding your emotions. And before we get to that section, there's a section on mindfulness and meditation, because that's a wonderful way to begin to sit with your emotions and really sit with how your emotions connect to your thoughts, connect to your physiology, what all the connections are. With mindfulness meditation, you begin to see it all so much clearer. And then in that program, we start with really an exploration of our values and of what we want, and an exploration internally to begin to figure out, who am I? So the emotional intimacy has to start first with yourself. So to summarize, beginning to think about emotional suppression as a tool you're using to regulate your emotions, that's probably not the most effective tool unless it's being used in those very specific occasional situations. So if you think of it as a tool you're using to regulate your emotions, you can then sort of open up to, hey, what are some of the other emotional regulation tools? And I just put a video out on that, so I can link that here at the end. Knowing your emotions are information, not enemies. Knowing that the emotion does not need to dictate the behavior that comes out of it. And also know you can improve your emotional regulation at any age. And I think it's worth doing. I think people who are emotionally regulated tend to feel happier and more satisfied in life. So I commend you for spending the time to watch the video. If you got value, please do hit that like button and subscribe. It's a big help. And I'll see you next week.